Hi everyone, my name's Perry Beasley-Hall. I'm an entomologist at the University of Adelaide in South Australia, and I research all things spindly, cave crickets, giant cockroaches, weird things that live underground and people should care more about.
When did you start
Ooh,
liking
okay.
insects?
Well, I think that ties back to, we were discussing education earlier and people changing your mind about how you feel about insects. So, a bit of background, I guess. I did my undergraduate degree here in South Australia at the University of Adelaide, and I thought I wanted to be a microbiologist because I did some microbiology courses, halfway through my degree, and I thought, oh, I'm kind of not terrible at these subjects. I don't really know what I want to do, but maybe this suits me. Turned out I was really, really bad at anything to do with microbiology and
Oh
totally bombed
no.
all of those courses. And then I thought, oh no, I need to change my major. Like, what am I going to do? So I majored in zoology. Um, but to complete my major in my final year, I had to do an entomology course, and I was really, really scared of insects at that point. Like, not just insect adjacent things like spiders. Like, I was really bad with anything that had, over six legs or more. So I took the course and I thought, I'm going to hate this. I'm just going to do this for the credits and then, I'll figure something out afterwards. But as it happened, I had some really amazing teachers, and they just introduced me to like a whole world, and that I had no idea existed, of insects and arachnids and crustaceans, and what what have you, all kinds of invertebrates. And yeah, I think just having that kind of mentorship and seeing how enthusiastic they were about the world of these like tiny creatures that I haven't really even thought about before made me think, huh, I could actually really get into this. So yeah, it wasn't until the last year of my bachelor's degree um, that I thought maybe this is actually like a career I could consider. And then I did a research project with the same people the following year and just, yeah, I haven't looked back. So I think, yeah, education is really important and having role models in your field.
Oh, that's so interesting because I know a lot of
Hmm.
entomologists are like, oh yeah, I liked bugs as a child. That's why I chose this major.
Yeah.
So it's super
Yeah, I've
interesting
heard
for
that from a
you.
lot of people. Yeah, yeah. I think I have a bit of a, I guess, an atypical background when it comes to insects.
Are you still like kind of scared of some of them, or is that like completely gone away because you're super educated about them
Oh,
now?
yeah. Well, I feel like so I don't know if you know very much about the kind of spiders that we have in Australia.
I've seen memes
They're
about it.
yeah. So I think there's like a stereotype that they're all like really dangerous and really huge, and actually most of them aren't very dangerous at all, but they can be really big.
Yeah.
So we have huntsman spiders, for example, those ones that they like flatten themselves against walls and they move really fast. Those ones, I'm like, nah, I can't, I can't be near them. But I think I have a pass because they're not technically insects, right? So I tell myself, I'm like, okay, it's allowed. I'm allowed to be scared of them. It's kind of outside my remit as an entomologist.
Do you draw the line of like calling something bug at actually like insects? Because I know bug is like a really stretched term. So do you count
Yeah.
arachnids and myriapods, or do you just say, okay,
Mm,
insects?
yeah, that's a good question. I think it depends on who you're talking to. Like, I have colleagues who, a lot of the people I work with do, science communication, and I have a lot of other colleagues who are just researchers, and they're really strict on how to refer to bugs as, oh, technically that's only anything in the order Hemiptera and things like
Yeah.
that. But I think it depends on your audience, right? Like, you need to kind of meet people where they're at. And if you start off by saying like, oh, technically that's not a bug, I think you'll lose your audience really quickly.
Hmm.
So yeah, I find that it depends on who you're speaking to, and yeah, I tend not to be super pedantic because most people will just know what I mean. I think that yeah, when you get into that kind of like semantic stuff, you can alienate a lot of people because often they're already thinking that what you're going to talk about is really boring. So yeah, it's a tricky one. I feel like I tend to be only really pedantic if I'm like talking to other colleagues, and even then it's mostly just to be like silly and make fun of
So shrimps
them.
is bugs. Gotcha.
Yeah, shrimps is bugs. Shrimps is bugs. I would say so. I think you can be like really expansive with that definition, especially because I think I remember reading that insects are actually derived from crustaceans, right? So
Ooh.
well, actually, I guess that would mean it was the other way around, right? Like bugs is shrimps,
Oh, technically,
technically,
yeah.
but yeah, I guess like what how would you phrase it? Like all shrimps is bugs, but not all but you know what I mean. So technically they're all crustaceans, I think, but I'm not a crustacean person, so don't quote me on that.
That's a funny way to think about it, actually.
It's weird. It's like how technically people are fish, I think, because I don't know, like the phylogenetic stuff is weird.
It's very weird, yeah.
Mhm.
Do you have a favorite insect?
Ooh, I think that's a hard one. I have two main kind of groups of insects
Mm.
that I've worked on in my career. The first are cave crickets, and they are really weird looking spidery things that you would not associate with a cricket or a grasshopper, but they look so strange, and I think they have a really interesting story to tell about maintaining the health of cave ecosystems and stuff like that. So I'm kind of partial to those guys, and also they live in a really weird habitat, and that tends to catch people's interest a lot when you're like, "Hey, I had to crawl into a hole underground to get these things." They're like, "What? Why would you do that?" But I've also worked on giant cockroach species before, and I feel
Ooh.
very defensive of cockroaches because, well, I mean, you can imagine why. Most people hate them. They're like one of the most hated insects, maybe aside from mosquitoes, I would assume. Um, so I think I feel very defensive of them, and they have a very close place in my heart because whenever I used to tell people I worked on them, the people would get like really, it was quite a visceral reaction, and they'd be like, "I could never do that. That's terrible. Like that's so disgusting." And I'd have to say, "Hang on a minute, let me tell you a little bit about them." So I think I think what I'm trying to say is I have a particular fondness for things that are considered like particularly gross because I get to then defend them and teach people about them.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I'm kind of about that with wasps because a lot of people don't like
Yeah.
wasps, but I think they're awesome.
Mhm. Yeah, wasps are really cool and they're so diverse, right?
Yeah, and so
They're a really cool
important.
group of insects. Yeah, absolutely. I can totally see why you feel that way about wasps.
Yeah. Because you got into your like academic career now, what has it been
Mm.
like to be in the academic like career path? Because I have not been in it.
Hmm.
What was your experience like there?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I should preface this by saying I can probably only speak for an Australian academic context, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
I know that at least in the US, and maybe like I was gonna say, oh, maybe other places too, but actually mostly just the US that we're very different from in terms of how academic careers function. I think in Europe it's actually quite similar to how Australia functions. So just as like a disclaimer for your audience,
All right.
um, I found it very rewarding. So I know a lot of people who work in the public service, which basically means that they are working as people in like agriculture or biosecurity and things like that, and they're kind of like they're not directly doing research, they're more doing kind of operational stuff involved in entomology, which is just as important, if not I would say a bit more important than the kind of work that we do as academics. But it's interesting when you speak to those people and you realize, wow, not everyone works in academia, and it's a very I think it's very different to like a lot of fields and what you would expect of a regular 9 to 5 job. So I have a lot of freedom in my job, which I really love. I can set my own hours. I'm kind of my own boss, which is really cool. I have a lot of freedom about what I research as well. So that's awesome. And I feel like anyone who really enjoys, solving puzzles and figuring out why things work would be really, they'd find that kind of job really appealing, which is why I've really enjoyed it. But because it's not like a lot of other fields, like I mentioned, there are also some more interesting things, I guess. We have pretty, I guess it's a pretty like cutthroat and competitive environment often,
Yeah.
and we have to apply for grants a lot to kind of fund our own salary and things like that. But I guess that's I'm probably getting more into like, oh, what is it like to be an academic in general, which is maybe a little bit uh, beside the point. Um, but yeah, I found it a really like rewarding career to be in. I don't do much teaching in my job, so I think most people associate being an academic with, like giving lectures
Mm-hmm.
or like mentoring students, which I do a little bit of, but mostly I'm a researcher. So I found that really satisfying because yeah, I can kind of set my own research questions, and I work with a lot of really diverse people. And I just get to look at, well, I was going to say I get to look at bugs a lot, but I guess technically the things I'm working on bugs. You can see that I'm using that phrase pretty liberally.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is it's often hard to explain to people what being like working in academia is like to people who aren't in it. In part because I've never not worked in academia as well, and so
Yeah.
there are a lot of things that are, like, super normalized for me that other people would be like, "That's really weird, why do you do that?" But, yeah, I think it's a really fantastic career path, but as I always have to say to, like, a lot of the younger people I work with, it's certainly not the only career path for, someone in entomology.
Oh, absolutely. What other career
Hmm,
paths are there? Because most people consider entomology very much of a academia career path. What other way could
yeah,
people
yeah.
take?
I think you're right. Most people associate it with very much with doing research. I think there are a few different paths you can take. So you can go into the more operational side of things, like I mentioned. So I work with a lot of people who work in agriculture and biosecurity. So, for example, they're monitoring um, pests and if they've arrived in your particular state or your particular country, and working alongside other people who might work with incursions of invasive plants or diseases and things like that. So there's kind of almost like a public health angle there. And that's a really, really cool position to be in. But you can also go in the other direction and, assist with research or be involved in research, but not actually be an academic. So I know lots of people who work at museums, for example. They work as curators or as collection managers. And that's a really important job too, right? Because we need to kind of maintain our, I guess, our register of natural history collections. And that's a way that we can understand if species have gone extinct, how different species are related to one another. There are some really interesting ecological questions that museums can help with. So there's kind of that side of things. And I also know a lot of people that go into things like, environmental law, policy, conservation, because the skills that you learn as an entomologist are pretty broad and you can transfer them into a lot of other fields as well. So, yeah, I feel like it's actually like a really diverse set of job opportunities for people in entomology.
Yeah, it sounds like you can do a lot of different things
Hmm.
with just knowledge about bugs, which is super cool.
Yeah, you absolutely can. Yeah.
Uh, why did you choose cave crickets or cockroaches? Because I'm assuming you got to
Mm.
choose what kind of insects and what field you want to work in. Why did you choose those?
Yeah, yeah. So I'm not sure if this is the case in other countries, but at least in Australia, it's quite common for more senior academics who have, a big amount of research funding, for example, to advertise for PhD positions or research assistant positions for existing projects. And so, in my case at least, when I did that research project I mentioned after my undergrad, which is kind of the equivalent of like a master's, I guess, in Europe. That was actually a project that was already being advertised by some senior academics that I knew, and so I thought, okay, I'll just start that project and take it up and see where it takes me. um, and then I did the same for my PhD, which is when I worked on those cockroaches. So I've kind of accidentally stumbled into a variety of different research projects that have just happened to involve like cool things that live underground. But I enjoyed it so much that after I'm not a student anymore. So after I started becoming, a postdoctoral researcher, I decided to continue that sort of research. So it was kind of a little bit 50-50. Like in a way, the projects were kind of given to me, or I took up an existing thing. But I had so much fun, and I thought it was so cool that I've kind of made a conscious choice to then progress my research in that direction.
Uh, what insects would you have liked to study? Like if you got the chance to
Ooh.
choose?
Yeah, like if I had like infinite money and I could
Yeah.
work on anything I wanted kind of thing. Hmm. This sounds like a really boring answer, but I feel like I would actually have done the exact same thing and I would just be able to do more research on things that I already like. But I'm really passionate about the insects I work on at the moment, and I don't think I would change much actually.
Oh, that's an awesome answer.
Mm, thank
I love
you. I'm
that you
glad you
choose it
think so.
again.
Yeah, I think I would. I had such a good time, and I think, when you do a bachelor's degree or when you do you know, any kind of like apprenticeship or training and you're still fairly new in the world of entomology or research, it's pretty hard to know how to design a research project just because you're not used to kind of thinking in that way. And so I'm actually quite grateful that I could kind of join on to existing pieces of research and contribute to them that way.
Oh yeah, that's true because you probably learned a lot of
Mm,
different things there from like people that
yeah.
already know a lot of things.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to learn how to like think like a researcher.
Yeah, I can totally understand that.
Hmm.
What are the most like challenging things of working in your field?
Ooh, that's a good question. I need to try and answer this without sounding too cynical, maybe, about
Oh,
working in academia. Um, I think that okay, two things, I think. The first thing is specifically working as an academic, so I can't necessarily answer this for, you know, entomologists that work in different kind of fields.
hmm.
But we have a lot of freedom in the job that I do, and that can be really awesome. But I think that most of the people I work with are like really passionate and really driven on, you know, what they work on as well. And so there's a tendency for people in academia, at least in my experience, to probably burn themselves out a little bit because they're like not because they're like stressed, but almost because they enjoy their job so much that they would almost do it like voluntarily in some cases. And so I think yeah, me personally and other people I work with tend to overwork a little bit because
Oh,
we like enjoy what we do so much. And that sounds like a super cliche answer, right? But yeah, I think that is a bit of a danger with academia. You have so much freedom that you tend to work on passion projects, and that can mean that you don't necessarily have mm, good work-life balance, maybe.
yeah, that's so you continue
Mm,
like after your actual work hours because you're so passionate about what you
hmm.
do that that
Yeah, and
line
I
kind
think
of
a lot of
blurs.
people, and a lot of people I work with, you know, they work from home, for example, and so it's more difficult to kind of institute that boundary with yourself, saying, okay, it's 5 p.m. I'm going to stop working now instead of, I don't know, reading about this cool insect that I really like. So I think like that's the first thing I would say that can be a bit challenging. And then I think the second thing is it can be difficult interacting with people who aren't entomologists or who aren't biologists, who can be quite, they can have quite a strong reaction when you tell them that you work on insects. And I don't know if it's because they're more willing to like admit that to someone who's an entomologist, but they can often be like, "Oh, why would you do that job? Like I could never do that. That's like so scary," and things like that. And so you often have to kind of educate people over and over again,
Hmm.
and that can be sometimes a little bit exhausting. Yeah.
Yeah, I can understand that when people like come up to you and like,
Mm,
"Oh, why insects? Ew."
mm. Yeah, absolutely.
But I feel like educating them also is like kind of a nice thing because maybe then they
Yeah.
learn something and maybe appreciate them more.
Yeah, I think I've never had that kind of interaction where someone has left and just said something like, you know, I'm not going to believe anything you say and I haven't learned anything. Sometimes they're like, "Oh, I didn't know that. I'm still scared of these things, but it's given me more to think about or something." So that's kind of nice. Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. I feel like educating people about insects is such a rewarding thing because insects are
Yeah.
everywhere around us and it's so important that
Mm,
people know about them.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, they're one of the most diverse groups of animals on Earth, and I think most people don't realize that.
Yeah. Now, a bit of
Hmm.
a random question. Have you ever eaten an insect?
Oh, okay. So I've been offered the opportunity to eat an insect a few times, and I've turned it down in every case. I got really close at one point, and I was like super excited, and then the product that I had bought, I just left it in the cupboard for months, and I was like, no, I'm actually not brave enough. I think they were like dried mealworms or dried crickets or something like
Yeah,
that.
that's the common
Um,
ones.
I yeah, I think I'd really like to, but I'm a little bit of a wimp when it comes to trying new food. Um, I know that some places sell cricket flour. I'd be super on board with trying that because, you know, it just looks like flour. But Yeah, I haven't quite been brave enough to try eating an insect just yet.
I feel like it's an interesting thing because technically they're just protein from the exoskeleton,
Mhm.
and I don't think they
Yeah.
taste like much.
Yeah, I've heard they can taste a little bit like nutty sometimes, but I guess
Oh
it
yeah.
depends on the animal. So in Central Australia, there's a group of Indigenous people there who eat what they call witchetty grubs, which are like I'm not sure if you've heard of them before, but they're basically I think they're like a really large beetle larva that are like maybe, I don't know, this big. Like they're
Mm-hmm.
pretty big. And they get roasted in fire, and then people eat them, and they're like really gooey on the inside and like apparently quite good. They taste like nuts or something like that. I would really like to try one of those one day, but I don't know. I'm pretty. I feel like I'm not brave in those situations.
Yeah, I can understand being like a bit
Mm,
skeptical and a bit scared of it because it's
yeah.
very weird when you think about it.
Mm. I'm bad enough when I eat shrimp, like the head when you have to peel them, and then I'm like, oh yeah. So I'm probably not the best person to be asking that question.
Going away from eating and killing, do you have a favorite insect
Mm.
in media? Kind of like Mothra from Godzilla or something?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I don't feel like we have, hmm, I don't feel like we necessarily have enough insect representation for me to have like a lot of options.
Yeah.
I know that a lot of people have talked about Ant-Man, for example, but I remember I got angry when I watched Ant-Man because I think they were referring to the winged ants as females when they would all be males, and then I just kind of zoned out because I was
Oh.
like, this isn't scientifically accurate. But I wish there was more insect representation in media because they're seen as so, yeah, I mean, it's like, you watch horror movies, for example, and then what's the prime example people use for something gross? It's always like a cockroach or a spider or something like that. So
Yeah.
I think, yeah, we definitely a lot of the attitudes people have about insects are contributed to by bad representation. So it's kind of depressing that I actually like can't think of an example because I don't know if I've seen a good one before.
Oh. I mean, a lot of people go
Mm.
to like Pokemon where they have insects adjacent.
Oh, that's true. Actually, I didn't think of Pokemon. I was thinking mostly of like films. Okay, Shedinja, absolutely. I think that's a
Oh.
really cool Pokemon. It's kind of scary. Like I think its Pokedex entry says something like if you look at the hole in the back of its head, your soul gets like sucked into it or something. But apart from that, I think it's really cool. And there actually are some really cool bug Pokemon.
I do think it's awesome as well, and it's like a very special kind of Pokemon because it's just the mold.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And it's like the way that it has the halo above the head, like it's kind
Yeah.
of depressing, but also cool. Yeah.
And it's super interesting because Pokemon actually did something interesting with a bug Pokemon. They usually don't.
Yeah, exactly. I think I started playing Pokemon when I was maybe, oh, I don't know, maybe 6 years old. And so I
Ooh.
was playing the second generation. And I think, yeah, the coolest example I got was like Paras because it was, infected with that fungus. But I feel like the character design has got kind of more interesting over time.
Yeah. Do you also have like the
Mhm.
small pet peeve when a bug Pokemon doesn't have six legs? Or is that just me?
No, that's definitely not just you. It really bothers me. Like I think, trying to think of an example because there are definitely some that I've seen that don't have the right amount of legs.
I think it's most of them
Hmm.
because some spider ones only have
Yeah.
six.
Oh, that's true actually. Like, oh my gosh, what's that green spider Pokemon that has the smiley face on its back? And it
Uh,
evolves into like Ariados, I think. I don't know. I'm pretty sure that only has 6 legs. So yeah, and that's meant to have eight. So that's not right.
oh, do you mean Spidops?
I think so. Yeah, it's like green and yellow, and it has like a smiley face on the
Oh yeah, like
Cephalothoraks.
the a Spinnerack.
Mm. Yeah, Spinarak, that's right. Doesn't that only have six
Yeah, it
legs
has
from
six
memory?
legs, and
Yeah.
Spidops then also
Mm.
has six legs.
Oh yeah, that's ooh. Yeah, I'm judging the Pokemon Company for doing that.
Yeah, it's kind of weird that they never get the legs correctly, but it's always two less.
Yeah. Yeah, that's weird. That's true. I'm trying to think if there are any insect Pokemon that have like 4 legs. Maybe Kricketot, but I can't like visualize it properly in my head. It's
Yeah,
like bipedal, right? So
yeah.
I feel like in my head it has 4 legs. Yeah, it's always, like, too few legs. I hadn't thought about that before.
Yeah, it's kind of like a pet peeve of mine now that I've gotten more into
Mm.
insects. I'm like, oh wait, no, all of you have the wrong amount of legs. You technically aren't an insect.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Yeah, I get really bothered in films when people use, like, giant burrowing cockroaches or hissing cockroaches
Mm,
as, like, pest cockroaches, and I'm like, that's not the same thing. Like, that's a
yeah.
completely different family. Like, what are you doing? But I guess they're easy to breed and people use them as props or something, so I shouldn't get too angry.
Have you seen Silence of the Lambs? Because they use
Mm.
Death's Head hawk moths in that.
Yeah, they actually they got the superfamily and the family correct for that, I think,
Yeah.
which I really liked. I rewatched that film about a week ago, actually, so timely, and I'm pretty sure the pupa that they used was the correct one, so I
Yeah, they
appreciated
did.
that. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I feel like in the NBC adaptation of Hannibal, Will Graham was an entomologist for his master's degree as well. That's like a weird bit of trivia, but that's kind of fun.
That's an interesting trivia. Do you
Mm.
what interests do you have outside of insects? Because you like Pokemon, you apparently like movies as well. What else are you like
Yeah,
into?
I really like scary movies.
Ooh.
I'm an absolute diehard for horror films, like particularly like art horror films. Um, what else? I'm really big into environmentalism and like climate justice activism.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I wonder if I should actually post a little bit less of that on my social media accounts in case my employer is like keeping an eye on anything. So like scary movies. Yeah, I've been very into reading about queer history lately, which has been
Ooh,
really interesting. Um, yeah, yeah, a whole range of things.
that's awesome. Do you have a random insect fact right now? Like your favorite insect fact?
Ooh, ooh, I have a few. The one I tend to give people is that there are 10,000 species of cockroaches in the world, and fewer than 0.1% are pest species. So
Ooh,
I think that's kind of cool.
that's interesting, yeah. Is it true that the German cockroach isn't actually from Germany? Because I think it has like an
Ooh.
Asian heritage and then it got
I think
wandered
you might be
over.
right. Yeah, so we have a species here that we call the American cockroach, which is Periplaneta americana. It's like the classic brown one that you see that has kind of like the yellow looking badge on its head and it's
Hmm.
on the pronotum. And it's like everywhere in the world. It's like the classic pest species you see, the ones that fly around in summertime in some places. Anyway, uh, people tend to think that that's like a North American cockroach. That's like another word that we use for it, at least in Australia as a common name. But yeah, it's actually from like very, very south in South America somewhere. So it wouldn't surprise me if the German cockroach actually had a completely incorrect common name. And sometimes I guess those names come about because, a lot of species are named or given common names before we actually know where they originated from.
Yeah,
Like I can imagine that, and I'm just guessing here, but I think the German cockroach was probably described in the 1800s.
I think
That's pretty
something
normal
like that.
for pest species. Yeah, and so, at that time, they would have had no idea about the evolutionary relationships of species and probably where things like came from, because if it was all around the world, then they would have had no way of reconstructing that spread. So, yeah, it happens a lot. Common names are often completely wrong, which is kind of funny.
But like with that, aren't the scientific names wrong as well if they call it Americana?
Yeah, I guess it would technically be wrong. Yeah. So there's a whole other and this is probably going to be like super boring for some people, but I feel like because I'm pedantic, I find it really satisfying. I had no idea before I started doing taxonomic research, so naming species,
Hmm.
classifying species, that there's actually like a really complicated international rule book on how you can name a species or how you can't name a species. And it's like it's all about Latin grammar, and I don't speak or write Latin, so I had no idea how to interpret this when I first ran into it. But yeah, there is also like technically a wrong way to name a species. Even if like you can name a species after whatever you want, it doesn't matter if it's like not technically correct with what the name is. But if you use the slightly wrong amount of Latin grammar, it technically invalidates the entire species name for some reason. So
Oh,
that's kind of a fun fact. Yeah.
but you can name it anything because that's
Hmm.
interesting because I've seen so many fun names. Apparently, there's a moth
Yeah.
named after Donald Trump, I think.
That wouldn't surprise me. I think that was I remember seeing that was like a cop moth, right? And then the larva, it was like it looked like his toupee. It was like
Yeah.
really fuzzy and orange and also like venomous, I want to say, or maybe poisonous because it had like barbs. But yeah, people name things after some interesting people.
You're trying to name some cave crickets after Pokemon, aren't you?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so that's been really fun. When I first started doing taxonomy, which was maybe a year or two ago, I felt like I had to be really, really serious, and we were naming everything based on, really strict scientific names. Um, and then I thought, actually, why not be like, why not have fun with it? Why not be a little bit silly? So yeah, that's been really fun to come up with names.
I love a little bit of whimsy because there's also like a sponge
Yeah.
named after SpongeBob.
Yeah, yeah, I've heard of that. It's really good.
So that's super fun. Like, have a bit of whimsy in your very serious research. Why
Yeah.
not?
Exactly. Like, why not? Why not be silly? Like, who's gonna tell me off, you know?
What would the common names evolve into then? Because the common names are like directly linked to
Oh.
scientific names usually. So,
Usually, yeah. Although you'd be surprised to know that a lot of common names, well, firstly, a lot of insects don't have common names because they're so like diverse.
yeah.
But a lot of common names actually derive from people writing textbooks and just like coming up with something. And then because that textbook is, accepted as kind of the reference guide for that group, it just kind of like materializes this name that everyone starts using. So yeah, common names are technically related to the species names, I guess, but like you could call it something anything you wanted with the common name. Like you could just make something up.
Oh, that's fun because I usually know that
Hmm.
like it's translations from its scientific name into like English maybe from Latin.
Yeah, that's quite common as well.
But it's kind of fun to think about that it's just a cave cricket called Zubat.
Yeah, exactly. Like I guess it wouldn't have I guess we could like come up with a common name. But yeah, I guess you could just call it like the Zubat cave cricket or something like that. Common names in my experience, at least in entomology, I think it's a bit different with other groups of plants and animals. They're used very loosely. So yeah, someone could just like come up with one after the species is described, and that's what people can colloquially refer to it as.
That's really interesting. So you
Mm.
don't have to give it an actual common name, you just have to give it a scientific name.
Yeah, that's right. And some things never get common names because, there are like, I don't know, maybe 10,000 species of like one type of wasp in Australia, for example. So they're just so diverse that, yeah, they never get a common name. Things usually get common names if they're very unique in some way, or if they're very like big or flashy looking, or if they need to be conserved, for example. So if people are doing like conservation efforts and they're like, oh, we need to make this thing more approachable. So we're going to give it a common name that doesn't sound like a big string of Latin characters no one can pronounce.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Hmm.
Do you have any tips for people wanting to get into entomology?
Ooh. Yeah, I do, I think. I'm trying to think of I was thinking of this earlier when I was like preparing to talk to you about like, yeah, what am I gonna say to people looking to get into the field? I should disclaimer, this may not be, relevant to depending on where you're from. Um, but I think the one of the best things you can do first is getting acquainted with, and this probably sounds like really obvious to people who are already in entomology, but I've had this experience interacting with students who have no background in even like what is an insect, what is a crustacean, that sort of thing. So I think even just having a really simple, background at okay, how is an insect actually defined? Like what makes that up? What is an insect compared to a spider? That sort of thing. And there are some amazing resources online for
Mm-hmm.
super introductory concepts to, biology, entomology. I found iNaturalist a really good resource actually for looking at the biodiversity in my area, and just yeah, getting an idea of okay, what is an insect, and then what's the biodiversity like just where you live, just to get an idea of the major groups of insects. I think it's really nice to do that through learning about your local fauna instead of trying to memorize, lists of different families, which can be fine, but it doesn't really have a real world equivalent that you can tie that to. And so I think it's harder to really like see the real world translation to. And then if, people are interested in studying, for example, there are some amazing online courses in entomology. A lot of them are free. And there are also some really amazing undergraduate courses at universities. Obviously, that depends on where you live. Unfortunately, in Australia, we don't have many undergraduate entomology courses anymore because they're not seen as, um, I don't think they're seen as very important because they're so niche. And so they're only attended by a small amount of people, and they tend to unfortunately get cut in the context of universities anyway. But I think if you're looking to, get into any like formal study, yeah, you can either approach your local university and see if they have any entomology or even zoological courses. A lot of zoology courses often have an entomological component, even if you can't technically major in entomology, for example, because that didn't exist at my university, and I had to kind of do that in a different way. Um, but yeah, I think just the most important thing is like fostering an enthusiasm and passion for the natural world around you. I think observing insects in the wild is a really neat thing to do. Go on a nature walk, for example, and take photos of all of the insects you see, put them on iNaturalist so you can better understand, which species they are. Um, I think, even when I've supervised student projects, for example, if they're undergraduate students or even high school students, even if they have no background in entomology, the most important thing for them succeeding and having a good time and getting something out of the experience, I think, is having that curiosity and that passion in the first place.
Yeah, the passion is definitely important to like even
Mm,
get into it, and
yeah,
then
absolutely.
getting a few basics and then just seeing what
Hmm.
you like most.
Yeah, absolutely.
For me, it's definitely moths and butterflies because those are very awesome and have piqued my interest from the start. So that's what I'm passionate about.
Yeah, I agree. So how did you get into getting excited about moths and butterflies?
Oh, it all started with, okay, this is a really funny story because it's straight out of a movie. I literally saw a
Oh,
singular winter moth and got
hmm.
so like flabbergasted about how cool this moth is, that I did research on it. Then I realized, oh my god, I totally neglected this kind of the world because
Mm.
it's so interesting actually.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's like a whole different world, right?
Yeah, there's so much to look
Mm.
into, and it's a rabbit hole because I looked into the winter moth and was like, oh wait, this is super cool. Then I found a different moth, and then I just kept
Yeah.
going down this rabbit hole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I think that's exactly how I felt, realizing there was this whole different world, and then you're like, hang on, I can actually dive really deep into this.
Yeah, I
Mm.
now also have a tattoo of a winter moth on my shoulder.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah,
That's amazing.
that was my starting point, and now it's also the starting
Yeah.
point of my tattoo journey because it was my first one.
Oh, fantastic. I really want to get a cave cricket tattoo at some point.
Do you have any other tattoos?
Yeah, just one. I have this one here. Hang on, let me
Oh,
whoop, gay tattoo. Yep, that's it. But I wouldn't mind getting a little cricket on my arm or something like that.
that would be awesome, yeah. Next to the
Hmm.
lesbian tattoo, absolutely.
Exactly. That's like my whole identity, right?
The gay cave crickets, gotta love it.
Yep. Yep. Gay cave crickets. There's nothing else important in my life.
What is it like being a queer person actually in academia? Because I know you advocate a lot
Mm.
for it, also with 500 queer scientists. What is it like?
Yeah. I've had a very good experience as a queer person in academia, and I think that's probably a lot to do with the fact that, at least at my university, uh, I would say that maybe 90% of the people I work with are women, or they're queer, or both. And so there's a lot of, I guess, openness in talking about identity, and I've always felt very welcomed, which is really awesome. I also feel like this is like a massive generalization, but I think these days at least, most of the people that I work with in entomology, or they're amateur entomologists, or they're just like bugs, a lot of them are probably neurodivergent, and so that makes it a lot easier to talk about other like marginalized identities, and that sort of thing. So that's been really helpful. But
You
yeah, I was
just
actually surprised getting into entomology about how diverse like the workforce is and the student body and things like that. So I've been very lucky to have a very good experience. Yeah.
you just called out most of my audience, I think.
Yeah, probably.
But that is
Yeah.
also like I did small research and like asked people, "Hey, are you queer? Are you
Mm.
neurodivergent?" Everyone in my Discord,
Mhm.
everyone on my social media, and the majority was like, "Yeah."
Yeah, yeah.
They're
I feel
either
like it's
or.
the yeah, I think it's the attraction to, like, I don't know, things that were at least in my case, I feel like there's some kind of connection to be made between, like, having non-normative experiences, whether that's about, like, gender or sexuality or, like, neurodiversity, and feeling drawn to animals or things that are considered, like, typically weird, and then not only that, but also then, like, really fixating on those sorts of things to actually make it into a career. So I think most of the entomologist people I worked with, even if they're like boomers and they're like in their 60s, I'm like, "Oh, you don't know, but you are definitely autistic." And they're like, "No, I just like sitting in the same chair all the time and doing the exact same thing in my chair at my microscope, which no one can ever move." And I'm like, okay, I see you."
So most entomologists were just autistic little children that liked bugs.
I honestly think that that's like 100% correct. Yes.
I feel like there's this like kind of stereotype, not really a stereotype, but like a lot of people would say that autism, like a lot of autistic people like insects or like
Yeah.
really like them compared to other people.
Mm, yeah, I think so. I think it's I feel like there's like some, yeah, there's some connection there, but like I'm not sure what the basis of it would be. I don't know if it's because, yeah, they're normally considered kind of strange or unusual animals. And so the people who are drawn to them tend to be the people who are like really, really like passionate about them. So those people tend to be neurodivergent,
Mm.
maybe. But yeah, I actually I was involved in a podcast a few years ago, and it was about queer people in science. And I think I made the comparison of like being a non-binary lesbian and like feeling like a sense of kinship with cockroaches. And I feel like it might have come across as like really homophobic, but it was it was like definitely not what I intended to say. But I think, yeah, insects tend to be, you know, underappreciated and sometimes maligned. But then you realize that they're actually like this beautifully diverse group of animals that are really important. So
Yeah.
yeah, I feel like there's some connection there, right?
Yeah, there's definitely a bit of a connection there with like being
Hmm.
alternative and being like out of the norm and just appreciating these like small little creatures.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I definitely feel, yeah, a level of kinship with cockroaches and things that live in caves.
Would you like to live in a cave as well?
Or that's you know, a lot of people ask me if I really like caving, and I say, "Well, the crickets I work on actually live at, like, the entrance of caves, like, right
Oh.
at the entrance, because they go outside at nighttime to forage for food, and then they go back into the cave during the
Mm-hmm.
day. Um, if I had to go, like, really deep caving, I think I would freak out a little bit, because I've done it before, and, like, it was okay, but I'm a little bit claustrophobic. So I wouldn't mind living in a cave if it was like the mouth of a really big cave, but I don't know if I would like to live like, I don't know, 1 kilometer deep in a cave.
Yeah. I think that's fair. Caves can be quite
Mm,
scary and like really dark.
yeah, for sure. And I'm actually a little bit scared of the dark as well, which is kind of ironic given my field, but
Yeah, it's kind of, but I can understand it because it's the fear of
mm,
the unknown, right? You can't really
yeah,
see and like what if something would be there?
exactly. Yeah, like I'm scared of the dark. I'm scared of like the really deep ocean, and I'm also scared of outer space. So I feel like that's all kind of the same thing a little
Yeah,
bit.
it's the being
Yeah.
scared of the unknown. You
Mm.
don't know what's out there.
Yeah, exactly. And I watch way too many horror movies, so even though they're not scary to me at the time, I feel like my imagination is like overactive a little bit.
Yeah, that could be.
Mm.
Like if you watch Jaws, you might be scared of a shark in the ocean then.
Yeah, exactly, because you're like it's like you think about it as a possibility, whereas if you never watch those films, you're like, well, why would I be scared of that?
Exactly. Uh, what do you think is a common misconception about insects, actually?
Hmm. that they're pests and that they're dangerous, I think, especially in Australia. Although I think that stereotype is probably more common with if I talk to people from overseas and we're
Yeah.
talking about, oh, I live in Australia, and they're like, oh, doesn't everything want to kill you? Which is like maybe 1% true for some of the animals here, but that's probably true everywhere, right? I don't know. Yeah, I think most people tend to think that they're like disgusting, they carry disease, they're dangerous, that sort of thing. And that can be really hard to correct because often that comes out of fear.
Yeah, but I think that's like an overgeneralization because obviously there are some dangerous
Absolutely.
insects,
Yeah.
like mosquitoes, for
Mm-hmm.
example, carry malaria and
Yeah.
different diseases,
Mm.
but then most other insects are totally fine. They're like really
Yeah, they're completely
important.
beneficial, right? Yeah, I think it's because, yeah, as you said, most people are not aware of that other world of insects, of like just how diverse they can be. And if you ask people to name how many species of insects they were, for example, I don't think they would have any idea. So it's, yeah, I think that they're just underappreciated, and as a result, people, yeah, make that really big generalization.
Yeah, they're definitely underappreciated and definitely not
Mm,
featured in enough media in a good light. Because I think
yeah,
media plays a really
absolutely.
big role. Like, for example, sharks also get a really bad name because of media. But
Mm,
actually, it's
yeah,
dolphins that are
absolutely.
really bad.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. And those tropes are perpetuated, year on year, and they don't go away because people just keep making like fear-mongering things about them.
Yeah. For example, if you go to like
Hmm.
insects in video games, they're often used as like big hordes of enemies simply because everyone wants to
Yeah,
squish an
yeah.
insect, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like, and in alien films, like a lot of the aliens are, based on insects, or they have an insectoid kind of body form.
Yeah.
Yeah, all of that contributes for sure.
Which is kind of unfortunate in my opinion.
Yeah, yeah, I completely agree.
How would you go about like teaching the general public about the importance of insects?
Hmm. I think most of the time when I do that, I link it to things like, for example, almost everybody likes chocolate, but most people don't know that the main pollinator of cocoa plants are flies. And things like mangoes, things like, I'm trying to think of like all major crops like cherries and things like that. And I think people don't really understand how integral insects are in the production of like major, like commodities and food and things like that. But I also think people might not have an understanding of the importance of insects in, I guess, the broader food web in the sense of ecology, because most people don't think about species in those kind of ways because they don't have that kind of background. So I think a really cool example is here in Australia, obviously, most of the continent is just completely arid desert, right? Um, but under most of the continent, we have an aquifer called the Great Artesian Basin, and it covers, I don't know, maybe 70% of the continent. It's this massive body of water underneath the ground of fresh water, so it's drinkable. And in some cases, the aquifer is like a kilometer deep, like it's enormous. And a really important role that insects have there is that there are these blind cave, well, I guess they're not cave beetles anymore, they're kind of just subterranean beetles. But they're a kind of diving beetle, and they're about a millimeter long. And they actually swim around and they shuttle all of these water purifying bacteria through the water column to make sure that it's safe to drink. And if we didn't have animals like that, we would actually have a seriously compromised, like, main source of our country's drinking water. So, yeah, I think people don't appreciate insects being involved in those kinds of pathways of things that keep us alive, like pollination, things like that, like global human health. Yeah. So I tend to go really big picture, and then people are like, oh, maybe I should care about this a little bit more.
Yeah. Do you think it's
Hmm.
mostly because they're like uneducated about it? Because I feel like most of the fear comes
Hmm.
from like not knowing something and then not liking them stems from they just don't appreciate them and aren't educated about them.
Yeah, I don't think it's like willful ignorance most of the time. I think that they're not educated, and that's not their fault either because, we don't have, at least in Australia, I don't think we have a very good basis for most people being educated about the importance of insects, whether that's like in schools, in media, universities, that sort of thing. But I think also it's a symptom of like a broader problem of people not being aware about the importance of species conservation. So even if you're not talking about insects and you're talking about, I don't know, like tiny crustaceans or even some small frogs or mammals and things like that, most people aren't aware of the, I guess, the degree to which species are threatened worldwide and the important role that animals can have in not only keeping humanity alive, but actually holding up the kind of house of cards that is like ecosystems on a global level.
Yeah, that's
Hmm.
that's a great way to think about it and like to explain it to people how important like the basis of them are for like everything.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, if we didn't have insects, I think we would last what, like maybe a month or something, because we would have no pollination, for example. Well, I shouldn't say no pollination. Birds are also incredibly
Mm.
important pollinators, and so are bats and things like that. But even so, insects do the main the main kind of job in, yeah, making sure that we have a global food supply.
Yeah, and then if you take insects away from birds and bats, they also lose more of their
That's
prey.
true.
So it's
Mm-hmm.
like it's just
Yeah.
a wheel that starts spinning and everything starts going downhill.
Yep. It's like when you play Jenga and you pull up the bottom rung, and then everything like dependent on that just falls down. Yeah, absolutely.
Is there someone that motivates you or you look up to, like generally?
Ooh, lots of different people. I think that uh, I work with some really amazing women who work in insect conservation that I would consider quite unsung heroes. There are a lot of not-for-profit environmental organizations that work really hard to make sure that insects have conservation listing, for example. So, in other words, if you go to a zoo, for example, you might see on the little sign for the species that you look at, it says it's threatened or vulnerable, and most of that is due to people on a voluntary basis writing conservation assessments and then submitting them to larger kind of global bodies that then say, okay, we're going to consider this thing in trouble, this thing isn't in trouble. And so much of that happens behind the scenes, and I don't think most people are aware of, yeah, how much effort goes into even listing like a single species and how much information you need and how much time that takes. So there are people I work with who belong to a group called Invertebrates Australia, for example. That's mostly a female-led company, and everyone is volunteering. They're really amazing. So just groups like that, I think, they really inspire me and make me wanna keep going and stay in the career I'm in to try and make a difference, actually getting species conserved.
That's a beautiful answer. When I wrote this, I was like, maybe like a researcher from the 1400s or something like that. But it's awesome
I
that you
well,
have
I
like a
actually
field around you that like
yeah.
inspires you.
Yeah, it's definitely, yeah, I would say more of like a network than a single person. If I had to name a single person, I could name a very so there's a weird story behind the history of, I guess, cave cricket biodiversity. Um, Most of the cave crickets in the southern hemisphere were named and described. So, in other words, they weren't just given names, but all of the research was done to establish how they were different from different species by one woman. Her name was Aola Richards, and she was the first woman in New Zealand, I think, to be given a PhD in biology in the 1950s. So she would have had a very difficult career. She was working around basically like everyone was male. And I can't imagine that working around a group of hundreds of male entomologists at that time would have been very welcoming. Um, but she went on completely her own trajectory. No one else in Australia worked on these insects except her. So she was from New Zealand. She described and kind of researched most of the biodiversity in New Zealand. The cave crickets in New Zealand are also called weta, which is where Peter Jackson, for example, got the name Weta Workshop for the company that made Lord of the Rings. Just a fun fact. Um, but Aola decided, okay, I've described most of the biodiversity in New Zealand. I'm going to go to Australia. Um, so she did, like over 2 countries worth of work by herself, which I think is really amazing. Um, and she's responsible for most of the information we have about cave crickets in Australia today and what I am basing my research on. She led a pretty amazing life from what I hear, and was I think really difficult to interact with by the sound of it because she was so insular and focused on this one really obscure group of insects. And she'd like be in caves all the time in like mud up to her knees and just, yeah, interesting person. And then she unfortunately passed away a few years ago, I think due to COVID, maybe, but I'm not really sure about her later life. But then she just kind of suddenly donated like $15 million to one of the universities that she was part of. So she was also loaded. I don't know. It's just a really weird. It's a weird story. So if I had to name someone, it would probably be her, but more because of her contribution to the research than like having actually known her as a person.
That's awesome. Did you ever get to meet her
Hmm.
or?
No, unfortunately, I didn't. She actually retired pretty young. So she retired when she would have been, it was like the late 1980s. So I think she might have been 50 or 60 at that
Hmm.
point. And then when she died, she was like almost 100 years old.
Oh.
And I didn't even know that she was still alive actually when I heard that she'd passed away. So I never got to meet her, unfortunately. And she retired to the UK, I think, in the 1980s. So she wasn't, anywhere near us in Australia. But I just think it's really cool that like one person literally single-handedly discovered, I don't know, like she described maybe 20 or 30, 40, I want to say maybe 30 or 40 different species by herself.
That's impressive.
It's really impressive. And she was doing all of that with no DNA data, right? So I should probably preface this by saying that most taxonomy these days uses DNA so we can reconstruct the evolutionary tree of how things are related to one another. Because when we work on things based on their external appearance only, that can be a little bit deceptive sometimes. So different species can look the same, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they actually share an ancestor and that they inherited that from, I guess, what you would think of as like a parent in an evolutionary tree. It might just mean that they evolved in the same environment and so they looked similar, but they're not related at all, right? And so a lot of people, when they used to do taxonomy without using DNA data, they would make those kinds of mistakes um, just because they didn't have any other evidence available and they did their best. But we now know that Aeola's taxonomy was 100% correct, which is really weird. And I haven't come across that before. And I mean correct in the sense that, for example, everything she described in one genus, when we use the DNA to reconstruct its evolutionary tree, they all kind of cluster in one discrete spot in their evolutionary tree, apart from being totally unrelated. Um, and that's a real achievement. It means that she somehow figured out the relationships of all of these species based entirely on their external appearances that she probably had to look at under a microscope to even see differences between different species. So it's really wild.
That's super impressive. And it's
Mm,
a very impressive person that probably most people have never heard of because she's only like
yeah.
semi-famous in your specific field.
Yeah, she's actually like, I think most entomologists haven't heard of her either. So the only people I know who have heard of her are like maybe in their 70s or 80s. And they're like,
Mm,
oh, yeah, I met her when I was like 20 or something. So yeah, she's actually pretty unheard of within entomology as well.
that's awesome. Because
Mm.
I personally thought of like Maria Sibylla Marian or something.
Oh, yeah, yeah, she's definitely inspirational. Yeah, her illustrations are beautiful.
Her illustrations are super beautiful, and I got a book of
Mm-hmm.
hers for Christmas, and I also read them
Oh, that's
online.
lovely. Yeah,
That's who I
yeah.
like took as a reference point for that.
Mm, mm. I can totally see why. I mean, she's basically considered the mother of entomology, right?
Yeah,
Mm.
it's so interesting to think that like people earlier thought that insects were just appearing out of mud.
Yeah. Yeah, they thought that they like materialized from like rotting things or from the ground. I mean, I guess I can see why they thought that, but you would think that they would have like observed metamorphosis at some point, but I guess not.
Yeah, apparently nobody did in like
Hmm.
the medieval ages, which is so interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, it's weird to think about because you just tend to think of that as like a really basic thing that, little kids learn when they're really young.
Yeah, but I wish people learned more about them other than like just their existence.
Yeah, yeah, I agree.
because then we're coming back to like the representation of the missing and like
Mm,
everything, and like also in the school
yeah.
systems.
Mm,
Because I,
mm,
for example, would have loved to learn more about insects, but then again,
mm.
I don't know if I would have loved them as much when I was a child as I do now, because I wouldn't have that
Yeah.
fondness for them.
I think it's a different kind of appreciation when you're an adult. Because when you're a kid, you like things if they're kind of cute or you can like handle them or they look really flashy or things like that. Yeah, it's a different kind of interest, I think.
Yeah, it's really fun to think about, like how much the
Hmm.
world has changed and the worldview of insects has changed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that was not even that long ago, not many generations ago. So, yeah, it's pretty cool.
One last questions. How does it
Hmm.
feel to be like cited in so many articles and to be in like podcasts? Is it like a really rewarding feeling?
Ooh, it's scary and rewarding. I think it makes me feel very like I was going to say self-conscious, but I don't necessarily mean that in a bad way. I mean like it makes me feel more conscious of my role in educating other people and that people actually like you know that thing people say when they're like it's like the fear of being observed.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's kind of like that. Like you realize what you say and you know the research you do is actually being read by people and being listened to by people and that can be really really amazing, but also I think it gives you a sense of responsibility that maybe you wouldn't feel otherwise, and that can be a really good thing as well, but it's I guess it just makes you more like aware of the impact of what you say and your ability to educate the public. So
that's an
good overall is what I should say, but
yeah,
yeah.
that's awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you for answering all my questions.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, this was really fun. I really appreciate it.